Hi everyone, this is Dre. I am a healthcare IT consultant and the founder of Dragon Consulting. And on today's video, I would like to talk a little bit more about pilot projects. So if you are new to my channel, then welcome. And if you are returning, welcome back. Last week's video, we talked about pilot projects and what a pilot project is, as well as what some of the benefits are. And for today's video, I'd like to talk about the elements behind a project that is in a pilot nature and really how we set that up. So just as a recap, for most healthcare organizations, when it comes to technology and implementing or rolling out technology changes, we don't have quite the same risk culture that there is in the general IT space. The fail fast, fail often adage is not something that we're particularly fond of. We, are trying to get a little bit better at it, but we do need to make sure that things are going to reasonably work before we put them in place because we are dealing with people's health and well-being. So for a lot of projects that are rolling out, pilots are often considered as an option to see if they are going to be viable and to gather more information on that project. So here is a checklist using the 5 W's and an H on what you need to determine before you start a pilot. So how you actually decide sort of what the parameters of the pilot are going to be and what it is that you're going to roll out as the pilot framework. So first, why are you implementing the solution? Who's going to participate? What scope are you going to include? Where will the pilot be implemented? When is it going to take place? And how do you know if it's going to be a success? So let's dive a little bit deeper into each of these. So first up, and most important, is why are you implementing the solution in the first place? So what is actually the purpose behind the need for this solution? What is the issue or the problem at hand? And why is this actually considered a viable solution to that problem? So what is driving the opportunity and how is this going to address it? So really make sure that you have a good handle on this before you roll out a pilot. It's very difficult to determine if something was successful if you're not actually sure what it was trying to achieve. And if you're not sure why you're implementing the change, then every other step along this path is going to be quite difficult. So you'll need to understand if the solution is supposed to resolve something completely or if it's supposed to just improve an outcome in some way. So the next thing that you'll need to understand is who's going to participate in the pilot. So in order to assess a solution or the viability of a solution for long term, you need to make sure that you have the right participants that are actually taking part in the pilot so that you can interpret the results appropriately. So you need to identify the clinical or administrative population that's going to let you see what the outcome is and that's going to allow you to gather the information that you need to move yourself towards that full scale rollout or that larger rollout. So one of the other pieces that you want to make sure that you don't forget when you're identifying who's going to participate in the pilot is people from the IT department and or other administrators who are going to support the pilot. So making sure that you've got all the right components in place and that you do have people that are going to support that difference in workflow in the concentrated area. So scope, you'll need to understand what the scope of your pilot is. So often you're running a pilot to understand cost, impact, and timeline for that larger scale rollout and to see what some of the parameters are that you need to make sure that you have in place before you can go enterprise wide. So it's important that you have a scope that's going to actually allow you to extrapolate off of that. So you can do this in a couple ways. And you need to understand if, in order for this to be successful, to get the information that you want, if you need to have the full functionality rolled out with a smaller group, or if you need a larger group and to scale back some of the components. So if you need just some core functions across a wider audience to roll out that way to see. So those are two very different approaches that you can take, and it will depend on what solution that you have as to which one is most important. You also need to consider when you're determining the scope of your pilot project, what level of functionality can be rolled back if the outcome is unfavorable. So you want to make sure that if you're looking at something with full functionality with a smaller group, that you do understand if the pilot is not successful and it doesn't prove your outcomes or your improvements, how do you get that out? And that may inform the scope of your project as your pilot project as well. So where is the pilot going to take place? So this is similar to defining who's going to take part in it. So you don't want to isolate your pilot project for something that's enterprise-wide to only a few particular roles in a few sort of isolated areas. You want to make sure that you understand enough about your pilot and that you're gathering enough information or getting enough feedback from it that you can extrapolate how it would work across the board. So a particular area, if you're doing that in isolation, may not be able to do that. And you want to make sure that you can actually sort of represent the whole appropriately. So you should, wherever possible, try to roll out a pilot or try to have components of a pilot in all the areas that the tool will be used in or in areas that are very similar in nature or comparable in nature. So when will it take place? Start date and end date. This is the one element that the vast majority of organizations tend to go awry with. So if something is truly a pilot, it is extremely important that there is a beginning and an end. So a pilot is for the purpose of determining feasibility and sort of understanding whether something is going to be achievable on a larger scale. It also is utilized to gather information to make that larger scale implementation more successful. And if you don't have an end date or you don't understand where that pilot started, it doesn't really qualify it as a pilot. So there needs to be a point at which you stop and assess and make a decision. So um, if the concept of start date and stop date for a pilot is difficult to articulate or difficult to verbalize in your organization, if pilots aren't really seen that well, then a smaller scale rollout with a decision date or a go no go forward date may be another way of putting it, but you do need to have sort of some time parameters around it in order to see if it's going to work. So last but certainly not least is how will you know if it's a success? So before you start the pilot, and not sort of at the very end when you're trying to make the decision, but before you embark on the pilot, you want to understand what your evaluation metrics are going to be. So remember you had a problem or issue walking into the pilot and you had a viable potential solution to resolve or to improve the outcome of that issue or problem. The same way you identified that why and around that same time, you should also identify what it means for it to successfully achieve its outcomes. So what are the key performance indicators that you're looking for? What are you going to measure? And those measurement points are going to help you sort of along the way, and they're going to help you tremendously when you're trying to use that pilot information and that pilot data to better inform your larger project. So you need to understand the measurements that you're going to have for calculating cost and timeline for the whole solution. You want to look at measurements for organizational change management, and you also want to look at measurements for outcome and if you're actually having the impact that you were looking for, either from a workflow or a patient outcome perspective. So if you have a situation where you're running a pilot project and there are no metrics, there is an increased risk of that pilot going rogue in the same way that there is if there's no end date. So if you're not sure what it is you're measuring and how you're going to achieve that, and at what point you're going to achieve that, then those pilots can go on for years. I've seen some things in pilot stage for more than 4 years. So it sounds crazy, but it actually has happened. And I think it's the how and the when and the why that are actually driving that. So some general tips for a pilot project. So throughout the pilot, you want to make sure that there's a couple things that you're keeping in mind. So you want to make sure that you have good communication paths that are set up for all participants, including individuals who may have unanticipated impact. So you also want to make your IT help desk aware so that if someone calls in and indicates something that you weren't expecting or an impact that you didn't foresee occurring, you can connect it back to the pilot and understand if they do have some relationship there. You want to keep an eye out for workarounds or inconsistencies with the flow. So this is going to help you understand whether your change management and training and adoption plans for the pilot as well as for the larger one are likely to be successful. And you want to pay attention to technical issues, of course, making sure that they can be addressed appropriately and effectively as possible. So when the pilots are over, there's a few things that you want to do. First and foremost, you need to gather the stakeholders that were involved in setting up and participating in the pilot to evaluate and review the metrics that you set forth. Next, you'll want to decide on what your next steps are. So is the solution going to roll out further? Is the pilot group that was using the pilot going to continue using it in its current form, or are they going to need to pause before the larger rollout occurs? Are there any changes that need to happen? And if those changes do need to happen, sort of how will they be implemented and what will happen to the pilot group in the process? And as well, if your pilot was unsuccessful, you'll need to decide on how that will be rolled out and how it will be communicated and evaluated going forward. And again, you always want to document everything that you're doing, including the results of your pilot, any lessons that you learned, and any decisions that you've made so that you have them to refer to later and to understand sort of where you have opportunities for learning going forward. And that's all I have on pilots for today. Thank you for joining me.